Okay, hello everyone. Today is Thursday, March 17th, and this is the Cluster API Provider Azure Office Hours. As always, please follow the CNCF Code of Conduct, be respectful to everyone. And if you'd like to speak, make sure to raise your hand and I'll make sure you get a chance to talk. If you can, please add your name to the attendee list right here. And I will share the document link. And if you have any topics or any questions, feel free to add them to the agenda discussion. All right, so we do have a demo from, or not, I keep saying demo, but I guess a walkthrough of how to write some end-to-end tests in CAPZ from James. Before we start, are there any new folks here who haven't, joined this call before and want to say hi and introduce themselves and kind of tell us what brought them to the project?
I think I might have come on this call once or twice, but hi, I am a PM supporting Cecile's team, and it's super exciting to get a chance to be more involved with the Cluster API.
Hey, Bridget. Anyone else? Josh, was that you trying to raise your hand?
Yeah, I'll jump in. I've been helping with some of the end-to-end tests with CAP-A and mostly lurking today, but hoping to help maybe jump in with CAP-C and do some of the same.
Awesome, welcome. Anyone else? Megana, is that how you pronounce your name?
Yes, I'm joining this meeting for the second time, but last time I joined late, so I couldn't introduce myself. I'm recently started contributing to CAP-E and CAP-A, and I'm looking forward to do some contribution to CAP-Z as well. And yeah, I'm looking forward to the demo today.
Awesome, good to see you. All right, and I think that's everyone. All right, so let's get started. James, are you ready to start?
Sure. Looks like we did get another item added to the agenda. Should we do those first, or?
Sure, we can. Actually, you know what? Let's start with the demo, and then we'll circle back at the end and make sure we leave the last 20 minutes for other topics if anyone comes up with topics in the meantime.
I just need to have access to share my screen.
Yes, I will give you access. Okay, you should be good now.
Okay, can you see? I don't know what you can see.
We can see VS Code.
Okay, awesome. That's where I wanted to be. I didn't seem like I could share my whole screen. I had a couple UI browser tabs that I wanted to share as well.
You can share two windows with Zoom if you shift and click.
Shift and click. Okay, hold on one second. Sorry.
At least on my version, you can.
No, it doesn't look like I can, so I'll just switch back and forth as we go here. Okay, cool. So feel free to interrupt me at any point in time. That the idea of this was to just, there's quite a few settings in the end-to-ends, and if you're running them locally and things. And so I just wanted to walk through what some of those settings do, and then talk about the different entry points that we have into our end-to-end tests, and do a little walk through the code. My idea was talk about the different types of tests we have, do the walkthrough, and then potentially show kicking off one of these end-to-end tests and kind of some of the things I do when I'm working on them. We have really 3 different entry points into our end-to-end tests. The first one is the cluster API end-to-ends. These are the ones that you see on the PRs. So you'll see, like, when you submit a PR, you'll see a whole bunch of tests run in GitHub. And that's these tests for the most part. They typically run against a released version of Kubernetes. And they run a suite of tests that make sure cluster API is working. It's creating the clusters, it's creating the nodes, it's creating the load balancers, it's creating the VNets, those types of things. It also includes some of the CAPI tests, like the rolling machine sets and CAPI adoption. We have a whole suite that we run that makes sure that we do all the basic CAPI tests as well as specific cluster API for Azure tests. The majority of these tests are entered through this script called CI EDE. And I'll show that in a few minutes here, but this is the one that you're going to see the most often and probably interact with the most. And then we also have another entry point for conformance, and the conformance can be optionally run on some of these PRs, but for the most part, these run in periodic jobs in Prow. And I'll show this in the dashboard in a minute when I switch back to the other screen. But these run either nightly or maybe every few hours and run the Kubernetes conformance tests, conformance suite, test suite. There's about 350 tests-ish that get run against the cluster. And so we use Cluster API to create the cluster, and then we run the conformance EDE test binary against those tests. And this is just to make sure that, you know, the Kubernetes version that we're building is conformant. And I use it extensively on the Windows side to make sure Windows is operating correctly. These typically don't run against a Kubernetes version. And they use the CI builds. So Kubernetes is constantly building CI versions with a bunch of different commits in it. So maybe 5 or 10 commits in them. And then they publish those binaries to a storage account. And anybody can access this storage account and pull down these CI binaries by going to this URL, where you replace the S string here with either latest or latest 122 or latest 123. And that'll pull down the latest binaries that were built most recently. So they most likely would be built in the last few hours off of whatever branch that was from Kubernetes. And so we actually use like those constantly moving bits when we're running against conformance to make sure that, you know, Kubernetes didn't break something in CAPC and vice versa. This script also has an option to build the Kubernetes binaries. So if you're testing Kubernetes locally and you wanted to, and you have the Kubernetes branch on your machine, it will go out and build those Kubernetes binaries and then push them to a storage account and then build the cluster with those binaries. And so this, we mainly use this for our pre-submits in Cluster API, but you could potentially use this to test your own Kubernetes components if you wanted to. And the way this enters is through this scripts CI conformance. And then we have one other entry point, and we use this by teams who are using Cluster API to validate their components. They typically run against a released version of Cluster API, so 1.2, or I think that's our most recent version. So this is our Azure Cloud Provider, Azure Disk, Azure File. They're testing those components, and they need a cluster to test them against. They have their own test suite, and so they run against those. It's designed to run any kind of script after the cluster is brought up. So it brings up the cluster, and then it will execute any shell script that you pass that to it. And the entry point here is this CI entry point script. So I'll stop there, and if anybody has any questions or I wasn't clear or anything like that.
Ashutosh?
So one question on Conform and C2E, like, so I get that, we could actually test, let's say, latest binaries from Kubernetes. So like, I understand that when the Kubernetes cluster is created, we have that node image, right? So how this binary gets placed, for example, how is the kubelet binary and other binaries getting into node?
Yeah.
Are we doing something like replacement, or are we building a new node image altogether?
That's a great question. So we take a reference, one of the reference images, and then we replace the binaries and the images that run. So I can show you that real quick. So in templates, so this is getting into some of the details, but this is, you're probably familiar with our templates. Our flavors live in here. And then underneath this test folder, we have a couple different other folders here. The CI is the one that uses this conformance and does that replacement. The dev is the one that builds those Kubernetes binaries and then releases them. So in CI here, if you come into Prow CI version, in here, we have a kubeadm bootstrap. So it's a complicated piece of script. I think there's some plans to maybe make this a little bit more generic. But what it does is it goes out and grabs the CI version. It grabs those packages. Let's see. Yeah, you can see it's actually pulling that version down from that URL that I gave you. And then somewhere in here, it's actually moving some of those packages. It's downloaded and then moves them and restarts kubelet so that we're actually getting the latest components. So
makes sense, yeah.
And it does it for all the versions as well.
Cool. So that answers. Thank you.
Yep, definitely. Any other questions before I dive in here? Okay, cool.
Bridget? Bridget has a question.
Hi, just related to that, do you have to exactly specify the ones you want, or can you ingest something like the currently supported versions of Kubernetes without having to manually go back and be like, oh yeah, they dropped 1.20 yourself?
Yeah, so the way these entry points, and this is actually a good way to get into the actual implementation, is you specify an environment variable that says I want latest, and it'll go grab those things. So let's maybe step through one of these entry points. Okay, so if we go into scripts, everybody seems to be interested in performance, so I'll kind of dive in there. So this is the entry point. They all are very similar. For every single cluster, you have to set your Azure subscription tenant ID and those types of things. If you don't have that information, it bombs out. In Prow, so when we run these up in Prow, there's actually a secret stored in the Prow cluster, and that gets mapped in, and we set a label on our job that tells it to map that secret in, and then we parse that secret to get those Azure creds. We do a bunch of stuff to make sure that things are already there. We need customize, go, all of those things. And then in the end-to-end test, we pick a random region. So these are the regions that we kind of run against. And then down here, if you're running locally, it'll actually map it directly into your kind cluster instead of pushing it somewhere else. And then down here, if you've set that build Kubernetes flag, it will go and actually build the Kubernetes binaries and push them up to a storage account. There's another script in here, CI build Kubernetes. And this goes and says, here's all the things we're going to build. it's going to go map those images and then build Kubernetes right out of the box and then push them up to a storage account. So we actually push those binaries and the images all up to the storage account. And then our test knows to go grab all that stuff and pull it down. So that's how we do that part. So in here, here's some other additional flags around just some settings. It generates a SSH key, or you can provide one. And then it'll call make test conformance. So it just makes sure a bunch of environment variables and everything's all set up. And then it calls into this make test conformance. And this is where I think it's kind of interesting. If we go down to the make file here. Okay, so it calls into this target here, and it's setting the Ginkgo focus to conformance. And one of the important things for the conformance test is that our Ginkgo focus here is not the same as the Ginkgo focus that is going to be run for the conformance tests. I'll show you where that comes in a minute. We pass some additional args. Test EDE local goes in and builds the latest cluster API image and then loads it into the kind cluster, and then test EDE run. What's kind of cool is we actually call Ginkgo here. And so we're not actually like running a script or something like that. We're calling directly into Ginkgo, and we're passing, in this case, we're going to be passing the conformance flag for Ginkgo and a couple additional things. And so at this point, we've now going to enter into this folder here called test EDE, and test EDE will come over to EDE suite. And this is the entry point for conformance, as well as the CAPZ PR tests that we run. And so it comes in here, it has a bunch of setup, and this is CAPI specific setup stuff. We're just kind of mimicking the same types of things, but it makes sure that there's a bootstrap cluster. It makes sure there's some kube test config information. And then this also manages how we collect work logs for all our clusters and things. And let's see, so there is so this is before the test suite. So this is the thing that gets started. So in here it goes it loads the configuration, it creates the bootstrap cluster, make sure the bootstrap cluster is configured with everything. And then finally, it's going to hand that off to, and this is where it kind of tears everything down. And then, so we have a bunch of different tests in here, and this will look familiar if you're familiar with Ginkgo, but this does the describe. So this is the conformance test. So when we pass in that Ginkgo flag for conformance, it's going to select just this test suite. If we were to just run, say, like the Azure tests, in here, so in here we have a whole set of suites. And this is what's run on the PRs. And this is our workload cluster creation. So this is the one that's run on the PRs. And this set of tests would actually be selected if we passed a different Ginkgo flag. But if we go back to conformance, there's a bunch of different stuff that happens here. It makes sure all the environment variables are all set. It sets up the secret for the cluster so that we can, set up cloud manager and cloud provider manager and things like that. And then down here is where it's going to get the Kubernetes version. So you specify an environment variable called Kubernetes version, Kubernetes_version, and you say latest or latest-121.22, and it will pull that out. If we go to resolve CI, you can see it's pulling out that CI version, And then if it was latest, it will call that URL that I was mentioning earlier. So it kind of bounces through and then make sure that all those things, and does some extra logic because you can actually specify some other versions and make sure that all those versions are correct. One tip that I would give here is if you're in VS Code or Golang or you're in some IDE, one of the things that you can do is you won't out of the box go to definition, get reference and those types of things. You can go into your settings, and in VS Code, you can set, where is it? You can set your build tags. If you set EDE, that will allow the compiler to see those files. You can do the same thing in Golang, and it'll give you those. It'll actually look at those files and compile them so that you can kind of hop around, which is kind of nice. So, okay, yeah. So if we're using the CI or PR artifacts, it does some extra information. Otherwise, it does some more setup. There's some extra additional setup if you're Windows. And then finally, it's going to actually create the cluster. And so we use CAPI's framework to create the cluster, test framework to create the clusters. And then at the very end, it calls into kube test. And so down here, this function here is provided by the CAPI test framework again. It creates a Docker container that's using the conformance image that's produced by Kubernetes. And then it passes a bunch of information to the conformance test, to the EDE binary, and runs it. The biggest one that it does is via this kube test configuration file. And this is hard coded right now. And it goes and looks in this data folder, kube test. And here it's a Viper config file. We don't actually use Viper anymore, but we're using the same format. So what it does is these are environment variables that you'd run to EDE test. You'd pass to EDE test. So Ginkgo focus, and this is where we're actually passing to run the conformance test. You can pass additional information here to do that. And for instance, with Windows, we pass a bunch of extra information. Windows EDE tests, we pre-pull all the test images because they're so big to make sure there's not flakes. So I pass just an extra flag to EDE test that turns that on. You can see that I can override the conformance. Windows doesn't have a definition of conformance, and so there's a subset of tests that we run and skip Linux only tests and things like that. And so when that is done, it returns and it does the cleanup and reports out the tests in XML format, and then Prow picks those up and runs them. And so, yeah, that's kind of like a full walkthrough. I've been talking for a while now. I can show just kind of running the conformance test, or I can answer some questions. It looks like there's a lot of information in the chat.
This is really, really helpful. Thank you, James. Bridget, you have a question?
I do. If any of us have paid any attention at all to Kubernetes land, we often see things about blah, 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 test flake. And of course, that kind of stuff can be handled externally, but I'm kind of wondering if in this particular suite, do you have any kind of like back off, retry, dealing with something not working, or is that like out of scope of what could be handled in this?
Yeah, so so for conformance, there was about a year and a half ago or something, Ginkgo has the ability to do retries, and the Kubernetes community decided to remove all those retries from the Ginkgo conformance test suites. And so we've removed all those now. So there are no retries on like a flaky test. And for ours, I don't think we have any like retries. So if we went into like Azure tests in here, yeah, there's like apply Yeah,
I
Cecile.
can take a stab at that. So actually, we do have some retries for some client Go operations that Jack added recently. So for some stuff that we think might fail, like for example, listing nodes or something like that, we have some eventually blocks, which basically say eventually this should be true, like this should succeed. So we give it like maybe like 2 minutes where it like is retrying. And if after 2 minutes we still can't get it to work, then we fail. And then in terms of like actually building the clusters for the Azure specific and CAPI specific PR tests, because of the world we live in with controllers, everything is kind of already a retry. So we're not doing a single operation and then seeing if it fails. We're applying the cluster YAML and then we're waiting a certain amount of time before we call it a failure. So it's more of a timeout than like a single operation. So let's say you apply your template and something fails in like Azure, it like tries to create a load balancer and that fails. Then like by nature of using a controller, that will like requeue and it will try again like next time and try to create it again. So we do have some resilience from that. Not at the end-to-end level though.
Yeah.
I would just say that we don't want any flaky tests. So retrying flaky tests is absolutely the wrong thing to do. Identify flaky tests and make them non-flaky. That's the thing to do.
I think that's why the team or like the Kubernetes ecosystem decided to move away from using the Ginkgo retries and the performance tests, because they wanted to really get rid of that kind of flakiness.
Makes sense. Thank you.
Cool. Yeah, this is an example of where Jack added some of those eventually, some things. Cool. So one thing that I did want to touch on that I think is important is, so I basically create an environment variable flag that sets up the environment variables for what I'm trying to do for whatever test. And some of the really important flags is that I use on a regular basis is skip cleanup true. So this won't clean up, especially when I'm doing development. So if I am, this won't clean up the management cluster, and it won't clean up the cluster that I just created. And so this way, if I run the test and I'm doing development and something breaks, I can go and investigate why it broke. If I don't set this flag, the test suite will clean everything up, and you just can't. You have to rely on logs, which isn't always helpful. And so that's an important one. Also, if I do that, once I've set up the skip cleanup, I can also set this other environment flag, skip create management cluster true, and then specify the kube config for the management cluster. And this allows me to not have to recreate the management cluster every single time. And so I can make a tweak to something and then rerun that cluster multiple times. I can also, if I'm working on, say, one of these E2E tests, like the Azure Load Balancer EDE test, and I'm trying to get this test tweaked or remove a flake or something. One of the other things that I can do here is specify the cluster name and the cluster namespace, and it will go and create it'll reuse the cluster that's already created. And so then I can operate just on that test and not have to recreate everything, which can take 10 minutes. And so I can just work on that individual test. So I also have one of these for the CI conformance that I use over here, which is basically the same thing. So. Cool. And so if I switch the screen, I guess right here, it's easier to just talk about it. So there's two tools that I use pretty regularly. One is QB. If you haven't seen this before, it allows you to target multiple clusters within the same shell. And so because we have the workload cluster and the management cluster, I can, it spins off a new shell instance and copies the kube config into that shell instance. And so I can have two in the same terminal. I can have two clusters, and I can kind of bounce back and forth between them without having to do extra exports or fancy stuff. And so it's super useful to target both clusters, maybe even 3 or 4 clusters. I use cluster.ctl to get the kube configs. And then I also put down a bunch of these commands and things that I do in this blog post. So you can follow up on those types of things. But yeah, it's super handy. I can do a quick demo of like, so right now I'm connected to
Hey, James,
a cluster.
we have a question from Ashutosh before you get into the.
Cool.
Yeah, I think it's very no question from me. Like you were mentioning about like Jinko focus stuff, like, you know, how can we skip the test? Like if I want to run a particular test, you know, how do I know, like, where do I find those env variables here? Like you were showing somewhere, I just missed that part. And how do we know like what to pass in? Like, is there any, like, I know there is a description for that describe block in the Jinko. Do we need to pass the whole string that's there in the Jinko, and then that means that only those E2 tests will run? How is that? Just wanted to like double click.
Good question. So the Azure tests, so these are the PR tests. Here you can, this is where you would find those strings. So anything that says context or it, you can take any part of that string and pass it to Ginkgo focus, and it will only run the things that match that. So it's a regular expression. So I can choose, so what we do in our PR test is we do it on this required. I think Jack recently added this. And so we just pass to Ginkgo focus required, and it will select all the tests that have, and the sub its that have that, and it will run those. But if I wanted to run, so you can see another required. So if we passed required to Ginkgo focus, it would run this one, the one above, it would run this one. But if I wanted to run, say, creating an accessible load balancer for Windows or validating just the network policies, I could take this and go over to my environment variable, and I can just pop it in there, and that will select just that test, as long as that's a unique string across the test suite. And you can do things like, you know, it's regular expression, so you can do all sorts of things to select different types of tests. And then to select like a specific conformance test, right now, the only way to do that would be to come in and modify this file and pass the same Ginkgo focus for a conformance test upstream. But I think I have a PR that I might morph into being able to replace these. So there you go.
Makes sense. Thanks.
Hey, so this is super useful. I do want to leave a bit of time for the other topics that we had. Do you think we're getting close, or should we like stop here and maybe do a part 2 and show test grid and artifacts and stuff next time?
Yeah, definitely we can do that.
Yeah, thank you
so
so
there's
much.
so much stuff to do in this test space. So.
But yeah, no, this was super well explained, and I will definitely be showing new contributors to this recording. All right, so let's talk about Flatcar. Let me share my screen again. All right. Cool. Mateusz, you want to talk about Flatcar templates?
Yeah. Hi everyone. So yeah, I'm this week as a replacement for Tilo, which is usually participating in those meetings, and yeah, I have like a hopefully quick question on the Flatcar templates PR. So yeah, there have been some tweaks I've been doing for the past weeks, and I also talked with Tilo, and he told me that I think you agreed that those tests don't necessarily have to pass for this PR to be merged. And yeah, it's failing right now because the images required for that are like configured only in our like private SIG, and the other not built, I think, on the one which is used by the CI. And yeah, I've been wondering if there is like anything pending to get this merged. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. So I don't remember agreeing that we don't have to have the test passing for the PR to merge. Usually when we add a new feature, we want passing tests so we can verify that the feature is working and that it doesn't regress in the future when other PRs merge. So the whole idea behind adding an end-to-end test for this is that we could validate it in the future. I understand that the image is kind of a blocking issue here. Like the reason that it's not passing is because there is no image in the subscription, right? That we could go and like build an image in a SIG, but then my worry with that is that it would be kind of a short term, and the image could get stale, like it would never be updated. So if we're merging this, we need to have a good plan for maintenance long term, so it doesn't just like drift and then eventually fail and gets removed to unblock other developers. I think we had talked with Thilo about his team potentially publishing an image in the Azure Marketplace for Flatcar as part of the Flatcar release process. So I don't know where that is at.
Yeah, we're also looking into this right now. Yeah, but like from what I understand from Thilo, this was sort of independent, but yeah, maybe not. I'm not sure. But yeah, we're looking into the publishing the images to the marketplace. Yes.
Cool. Does anyone else have any thoughts or questions or opinions on this? Okay, yeah. Don't see any hands, but yeah, my take is that we should definitely not merge a PR with a failing test. I think that's a blocker for merging the PR.
All right. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay. Yeah, then we'll focus our efforts to get them published to the marketplace.
Okay.
That's feasible. Thanks.
Awesome. The good news is that the test is failing, which is good. That means the test is there and it's working, and now we can just rerun it and validate that
Oh yeah, the test failed successfully.
It's in a good place. Yeah, so thank you for adding it. Cool. Is there anything else you wanted to talk on this topic, or is that pretty much it?
No, I'm good. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. All right. Async role assignment PR. Ashutosh.
Yeah, so like, I worked upon the review comments and I'm observing that this E2E test actually fails consistently. So like, I think it's not a flake, but like, before I deep down more, I wanted to check with you folks, like by seeing the logs, I can't make sense because like it fails for like 3 control plane nodes, 2 Linux and 2 Windows worker nodes. And one more like, and I'm not sure like how is it related with that. So like if there is any suggestion or heads up, just wanted to know on that. Else I will look into that.
Yeah, so actually this is, I guess, a good follow-up for our end-to-end session, but
Yeah,
like
sure.
when I see something like this, I guess with like 4 tests failed, and that kind of tells me it's not a flake, because like unless you got very unlucky and all of them flaked at the same time, it seems like something's like fundamentally wrong, and it's not building the cluster. Did you try digging into the artifacts folder and seeing kind of what's going on in the CAPZ controller logs?
I did not, like I'll do that. I didn't get time to do that, but I just wanted to check like if there is any small thing that I'm missing. But yeah, I'll go in more deeper into this.
There's no like known, E2Es are broken this morning, as far as I know of. I haven't checked other PRs yet, but for your sanity, you could also just retest it once and see if it fails the same way again, or if you get different results. But yeah, I would dig into the logs and see what's going on. Yeah, if you want, we can dive in together if there are no other topics for a bit. Unless, yeah, up to you.
Sure.
Okay, I guess let's just first check if no one else has questions before we start getting into the weeds. Do we have any other questions or any comments or anything that anyone wanted to bring up today? Oh, and Shyam already found the issue in the background. I guess we can still look at it and be like, this is how you would debug an end-to-end test for, for the learning aspect of it.
Yep.
Okay, no other questions. I don't see any hands raised. So artifacts is where all the logs are kept after a test run. So if you go, and I'm telling this for the recording, by the way, I know you know this, but if you go into clusters, and so here's like the Bootstrap cluster, and then these are all the logs for the workload clusters. Right now, there's only one, I guess, because all the other ones didn't get far enough to have logs. And then if you look into controllers, CabZ controller manager, that's the CabZ logs. It's usually the first place I look, since that's the code we're changing. And I guess, or it's nil pointer, so I'll scroll to the bottom. Yeah. So this is, probably what's going on here. Get VM principal ID, and then you can check the line and see exactly what the issue is. But it's probably happened several times in the loop and restarted. Oh, actually only happened once and it just gave up. Interesting. But yeah, this is where usually a lot of the answers are in the CabZ controller logs when it's something CabZ related in a PR. But if you need to dig into CAPI logs, you can also look at the core CAPI and then the Bootstrap logs and the control logs in here.
Right. I can see there is like a nil pointer, and Sam has also messaged about that. So
yes, true. And there is, I think Pro is having some issues due to GitHub having some issues and having degraded service. So if you run into slowness when trying to comment, retest or anything like that today, that's probably why.
sure, I'll give a shot to this, and I'll try once more, and we can chat more on Slack on this one. So
yeah, no worries.
Thank you. Thanks, Cecil. Thank you, Sam, for the pointer.
All right. Any other questions or closing thoughts before we split? All right, I guess milestone quickly. Did I keep the just going to quickly show where we're at for the next release 1.3. And we're doing pretty well. There are 2 new bugs that popped up recently, and those are both unassigned right now. So if you're looking for something to work on, these are good ones. I think they're both pretty straightforward. Didn't mark them as good first issue because it requires like understanding, controllers, but it's pretty straightforward. The fix shouldn't be too difficult. So yeah, and then everything else is, I think, being worked on and on track. Any questions on that? All right, cool. And then next week, I guess we can, I don't think we have any host or, walkthrough yet signed up. I don't know if James, you wanted to do a part 2 or not. We can also do that another time later. But if anyone wants to sign up for a demo or anything, like please reach out and we can make it happen. All right. Thanks everyone. Have a lovely day.
Thank you, everyone.
And James for the great demo.
Thanks, James.
Thanks, James,
Thank you.
for the
Bye-bye.
wonderful session. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you all.